There are victories that crown kings, and there are victories that forge empires. But once in 1,000 years, there comes a victory that decides whether an entire civilization will survive or vanish into the dust of history. In the autumn of 732, such a moment arrived, and the fate of Europe, the fate of Christianity itself, hung by a thread so thin that one battle, one decision, one man could cut it forever. The early 8th century was an age of conquest unlike any the world had ever seen. From the scorching deserts of Arabia, a new faith had erupted with the force of a sandstorm, sweeping across continents with breathtaking speed. Islam, born in the revelations of the Prophet Muhammad, had united the warring tribes of the Arabian Peninsula into a force of terrifying power. Within decades, Muslim armies had shattered the Persian Empire, conquered Byzantine territories that had stood for centuries, and rolled across North Africa like an unstoppable tide. By 711, they had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and poured into Spain. The Visigothic kingdom, which had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for 3 centuries, collapsed in barely 7 years. Cities that had never known defeat opened their gates or burned to ashes. Toledo fell. Cordoba fell. One by one, the great fortresses of Spain surrendered to commanders who promised protection to those who submitted and destruction to those who resisted. The Muslim advance brought more than just armies. It brought scholars, architects, poets, and administrators who transformed conquered lands into centers of learning and prosperity. But to the Christians watching from the north, it looked like the end of their world. Europe in 732 was nothing like the Europe we know today. There was no France, no Germany, no England as unified nations. Instead, scattered kingdoms and tribal territories fought among themselves, weakened by centuries of decay since the fall of Rome. The Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Frankish lands, had grown soft and powerless. The real authority belonged to the mayors of the palace, administrators who commanded armies and controlled treasuries, while puppet kings sat on thrones and did nothing. Into this vacuum of power stepped a man who would become legend. Charles was born a bastard, the illegitimate son of Pepin of Herstal, a powerful Frankish nobleman. In a world where bloodlines meant everything, Charles had nothing. No inheritance, no claim, no legitimacy. When his father died, rivals circled like wolves, ready to tear apart everything Pepin had built. They threw Charles into prison, certain he would rot there, forgotten and powerless. But they underestimated him. Charles escaped. He gathered loyal warriors to his side. He fought his way back to power through sheer force of will, crushing his enemies one by one in a series of brutal campaigns. Those who fought beside him saw something in this bastard son that others had missed. He was relentless, unyielding, unstoppable. They began to call him Martel, the Hammer. By 731, Charles Martel controlled much of the Frankish kingdom. He had no royal title, no crown, but he commanded the loyalty of hardened warriors who had bled with him on a dozen battlefields. He had forged his authority not through birthright but through victory after victory against Frankish rivals, Germanic tribes, and anyone foolish enough to challenge him. And now, as word reached him of a new threat from the south, Charles understood that everything he had fought for, everything his people believed in, faced annihilation. The Muslim army that crossed the Pyrenees in 732 was massive. Estimates vary, but chroniclers spoke of 40,000 warriors, perhaps more. They were led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus, a commander of extraordinary skill and ambition. Abdul Rahman was no mere raider seeking plunder. He commanded a professional army, disciplined and experienced, with cavalry that had shattered every foe they had ever faced. These horsemen rode swift Arabian stallions, wielded curved swords that could behead a man with a single stroke, and moved across the battlefield with a coordination that European armies could not match. They had conquered from Arabia to Spain. Now they looked north, toward the soft divided lands of the Franks. The army swept through Aquitaine like fire through dry grass. Bordeaux, one of the great cities of Gaul, fell after a brief siege. The Muslims sacked it thoroughly, carrying away treasures and captives. Duke Odo of Aquitaine, the regional power who had tried to stand against them, saw his army shattered in open battle. His men fled, his nobles abandoned him, and Odo himself barely escaped with his life. Monasteries burned, villages were put to the sword. Refugees streamed north, bringing tales of horror that grew worse with each retelling. The Muslims were coming, Nothing could stop them. God himself had abandoned Christian Europe. Duke Odo, humiliated and desperate, did the one thing he had sworn never to do. He rode north to beg for help from Charles Martel, the man he had once fought against, the bastard he had once dismissed as unworthy of respect. He fell to his knees before Charles and pleaded. If the Franks did not march, if Charles did not come south with every warrior he could muster, then all of Christendom would fall. The Muslim army was not raiding, it was conquering, and its next target was Tours. Tours was no ordinary city. It was the spiritual heart of Christian Gaul, home to the Basilica of St. Martin, one of the most sacred sites in all of Europe. Pilgrims came from across the continent to pray at the tomb of St. Martin, the soldier who had become a saint, the protector of France. If Tours fell, if its churches burned and its relics were carried away, then the faith of every Christian would shatter. Charles knew this. He knew that if he did nothing, history would remember him as the man who let Europe die. But if he marched south, he would face an army larger, more experienced, and more deadly than any he had ever fought. His Frankish infantry, tough as they were, had never faced cavalry like this. His numbers were smaller. His men were farmers and tribesmen pressed into service, not professional soldiers. By every measure, he was outmatched. Charles Martel made his choice. He sent messengers racing across the Frankish lands, summoning every warrior who could hold a spear. He called upon old allies and new, upon men who owed him loyalty and men who feared what would happen if they refused. Slowly, an army gathered. They were not knights in shining armor. They were rough men with leather jerkins, round shields, and axes or spears passed down from their fathers. But they came, and Charles drilled them relentlessly. He taught them to lock their shields together, to stand shoulder to shoulder, to hold their ground no matter what terror came charging at them. He told them they were not just fighting for land or gold. They were fighting for their families, their faith, their very existence. By October, Charles had perhaps 30,000 men, perhaps fewer. He marched them south toward Tours, knowing that somewhere ahead, Abdul Rahman waited with an army that had never known defeat. The two forces were converging. The greatest collision of the age was about to begin, and the future of an entire civilization would be decided in the days to come. The armies met on the old Roman road between Tours and Poitiers in mid-October of 732. For days, autumn rains had turned the countryside into a patchwork of mud and sodden grass, but now the skies had cleared, and a cold wind blew down from the north. Charles Martel chose his position with the precision of a master craftsman. He positioned his Frankish army on a wooded hillside, a natural fortress where trees would break cavalry charges, and high ground would force the enemy to attack uphill. His men formed their battle line along the crest, shields locked together in the ancient formation their ancestors had used against Rome itself. They waited. From the plains below, the Muslim army approached like a thundercloud rolling across the earth. 40,000 warriors, perhaps more, spread across the valley in a display of power meant to terrify. Their banners rippled in the wind, green and white silk emblazoned with Arabic script praising God. The cavalry formations stretched as far as the eye could see, thousands upon thousands of horsemen sitting atop Arabian and Berber horses, their armor gleaming in the pale October sun. These were men who had ridden from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of the Atlantic, who had conquered 3 continents, who had never met an army they could not destroy. They looked up at the Frankish shield wall and saw only another obstacle to be swept aside. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi studied the enemy position from horseback, his experienced eye taking in every detail. He saw immediately what Charles had done. The Frankish commander had negated the Muslim cavalry's greatest advantage by choosing terrain where horses could not maneuver freely, where trees would tangle their formations, where uphill charges would exhaust even the finest mounts. It was clever, but Abdul Rahman had faced clever commanders before, and they all lay dead in his wake. He had something the Franks did not have: time. His army was well supplied, his men confident. He could wait for Charles to make a mistake, to grow impatient, to abandon his strong position and descend into the plains where cavalry could annihilate infantry. For 7 days and 7 nights, the two armies stared at each other across the autumn fields. Neither commander would budge. Charles knew that every day he held his position, more reinforcements trickled in from across the Frankish lands, swelling his numbers. Abdul Rahman knew that winter was coming, that his supply lines stretched all the way back to Spain, that his men grew restless holding position when they were accustomed to swift conquest. At night, the valley glowed with thousands of campfires. Frankish sentries watched the Muslim camp, counting fires, trying to estimate numbers, praying to saints for protection. Muslim warriors sharpened their swords, fed their horses, and wondered why these barbarian Franks did not simply flee as so many others had done. The standoff could not last forever. Scouts clashed in the no-man's land between the armies. Small skirmishes erupted and faded. Tension mounted with each passing hour. Abdul Rahman's officers urged him to attack, to crush these Franks and move on to Tours before the full weight of winter fell upon them. The men whispered that the longer they waited, the more their advantage slipped away. And there were other concerns. Behind the Muslim lines, stretching back for miles, lay the baggage train. Wagons loaded with plunder from Bordeaux, from Aquitaine, from a dozen sacked cities and monasteries. Gold, silver, silks, relics, the accumulated wealth of an entire campaign. It was the reward these warriors had earned through months of hard fighting, and it sat vulnerable, guarded by only a fraction of the army. On the seventh day, October the 10th, 732, Abdul Rahman made his decision. He could wait no longer. His cavalry would do what it had done 1,000 times before. It would shatter the enemy line through sheer power and momentum, and these Frankish farmers would break and run like all the others. He gave the order. The army would attack at dawn. As the sun rose on that cold October morning, painting the eastern sky in shades of crimson and gold, the Muslim cavalry began to form their battle lines. The sound alone was terrifying. Tens of thousands of hooves stamping the earth, the jangle of harnesses and armor, the shouts of commanders organizing their squadrons, horses snorting clouds of breath into the cold air, warriors chanting prayers, calling upon God to grant them victory over the infidels. The Frankish soldiers on the hillside watched this spectacle and felt their courage waver. Many had never seen a professional army of this size. They were farmers and tradesmen who had answered Charles Martel's call, who carried their father's weapons and wore whatever armor they could afford. They did not look like heroes. They looked like frightened men far from home. Charles Martel rode along the Frankish line on his warhorse, his voice carrying over the growing din. He reminded his warriors why they stood here. He pointed to the south, toward Tours, toward the basilica that held the bones of Saint Martin. He told them that if they broke, if they ran, then their wives and children would be next. Their churches would burn. Their faith would be erased. He told them that the Muslims had never faced men like them, men who would rather die than yield 1 foot of their homeland. Hold your ground, he commanded, his voice like iron. Lock your shields. Stand together. Let them break themselves against us like waves against a cliff. Today we do not fight for glory. We fight for survival. The first charge came like an avalanche. Thousands of horsemen surged forward, a wall of muscle and steel thundering up the hillside. The ground shook beneath their hooves. Dust rose in choking clouds. The Muslim warriors screamed their battle cries, raising their curved swords high, absolutely certain that this rabble of Frankish infantry would scatter at the first impact. They had seen it happen 100 times before. Infantry always broke before cavalry. It was the law of war, written in blood across every battlefield from Damascus to the Pyrenees. But the Frankish shield wall did not break. As the cavalry crashed into them, the locked shields absorbed the terrible impact. Horses reared and screamed, impaling themselves on the forest of spears that jutted from the Frankish ranks. Riders who made it through the first line found themselves tangled in the press of bodies, their swords hacking down at helmets and shields, while Frankish axes and spears stabbed upward at horses and men. The collision was deafening, the clash of iron on wood echoing across the valley like thunder. For a moment the line buckled, men staggered, shields splintered. But behind the front rank, more Franks pressed forward, closing gaps, replacing fallen comrades. The formation bent but did not shatter. The Muslim cavalry pulled back, reformed, and charged again, and again, and again. Each time they expected the line to collapse. Each time it held. Hours passed in this brutal rhythm. Charge, clash, withdraw, reform, charge again. The hillside became a nightmare of mud and blood. Dead horses lay in heaps, their riders crushed beneath them or hacked to pieces by Frankish blades. The Frankish warriors, though battered and bleeding, refused to yield. They had become a human wall, immovable as stone. By midday, frustration turned to desperation in the Muslim ranks. This was not how battles were supposed to go. Infantry did not stand against cavalry. Barbarians did not defeat the armies of the Caliphate. But these Franks were doing the impossible. And with every failed charge, the momentum shifted. Then, fate intervened. A rumor, perhaps started by Frankish scouts who had circled behind the Muslim lines, perhaps born from the fears of warriors worried about their plunder, began to spread through the Muslim cavalry. The baggage train was under attack. The treasure, everything they had fought for, was being looted by Frankish raiders. Panic rippled through the ranks like wildfire. Warriors who had charged fearlessly into the shield wall moments before now wheeled their horses around, desperate to protect their rewards. Officers shouted, trying to maintain order, but the discipline that had carried Islam across 3 continents began to crumble. Squadrons broke away, racing toward the rear. Others hesitated, torn between duty and greed. The unified assault dissolved into chaos. Charles Martel saw it happen. From his position behind the lines, he watched the enemy formation disintegrate. This was the moment. This was when the hammer fell. He gave the order, and the Frankish infantry surged forward, pouring down the hillside with axes and spears raised high, crashing into the confused Muslim cavalry with the fury of men who sensed victory within their grasp. The battle had reached its breaking point. But the outcome still hung in the balance, and in the chaos of that terrible afternoon, the fate of Europe remained undecided. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across a battlefield transformed into hell on earth. What had begun as a disciplined cavalry assault had descended into a maelstrom of confusion and carnage. The Muslim army, moments ago confident in its inevitable victory, now found itself fighting on 2 fronts. Some warriors struggled to hold a line against the advancing Franks, while others had abandoned the battle entirely, racing back toward the baggage train in a desperate attempt to save their plunder. The cohesion that had carried Islam from Arabia to the Pyrenees was unraveling before the eyes of every man on that blood-soaked hillside. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi rode through the chaos like a man possessed, his voice hoarse from shouting commands that no one seemed to hear. He was a veteran of countless battles, a commander who had never tasted defeat, and he understood with terrible clarity what was happening. If he could not restore order, if he could not rally his men back into formation, then everything would be lost. Not just this battle, but the entire campaign, perhaps the entire dream of carrying Islam into the heart of Europe. He spurred his horse forward, riding directly into the thickest fighting, his sword flashing as he cut down Frankish warriors, trying through sheer force of will and personal courage to turn the tide. But courage alone could not save him. In the savage press of combat, where thousands of men hacked and stabbed at anything within reach, Abdul Rahman became just another target. The accounts differ on exactly how it happened. Some say a Frankish spearman pierced him through the chest. Others claim an axe blow brought him down. What matters is this. Somewhere in that afternoon of slaughter, the commander who had led his army across mountains and rivers, who had seemed destined to conquer all of Gaul, fell from his horse and did not rise again. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi was dead. The news spread through the Muslim ranks like poison. Warriors who had fought with absolute confidence suddenly felt fear grip their hearts. Their general, their leader, the man who had guided them to victory after victory, was gone. Without him, there was no center, no command, no purpose. What had been an army became a mob. What had been a conquest became a rout. As darkness began to fall over the battlefield, the Muslim cavalry abandoned the field entirely. Some fled south toward the Pyrenees, others scattered into the French countryside, and still others huddled in their camp, paralyzed by shock and grief. The great invasion was over. Charles Martel, exhausted and covered in the gore of battle, did not allow triumph to cloud his judgment. Lesser commanders might have ordered an immediate pursuit, chasing the broken enemy into the night, seeking total annihilation. But Charles had not survived years of warfare through recklessness. He knew that night battles were chaos, that his own men were as exhausted as the enemy, that a disorganized pursuit could easily turn into an ambush. Instead, he held his warriors together, keeping them in formation on the hillside they had defended so desperately. They would hold the field. They would tend to their wounded. They would bury their dead. And when morning came, they would see if the enemy dared to return. When dawn broke on October the 11th, 732, silence lay over the valley like a shroud. The Muslim camp stood empty. During the night, the survivors had slipped away, abandoning their tents, their supplies, even much of the treasure they had fought so hard to protect. They fled south in scattered groups, desperate to reach the safety of Spain before winter or Frankish patrols could catch them. They left behind thousands of dead, both men and horses, carpeting the hillside in a testament to the ferocity of the battle. Among the corpses, Frankish soldiers found the body of Abdul Rahman, and they brought it to Charles Martel. The commander who had threatened to conquer Europe lay dead, and with him died the dream of Muslim domination over the Christian north. The Franks had won. Against all odds, against a force that had seemed unstoppable, they had held their ground and turned back the tide. The victory was not clean or easy. Thousands of Frankish warriors would never see their homes again. The hillside near Tours had drunk deep of European blood, but they had survived. And survival, in that desperate autumn, was enough. News of the battle spread across Europe like wildfire. In monasteries and churches, monks recorded the event as nothing less than divine intervention, a miracle where God himself had empowered Christian warriors to defeat the Muslim horde. Charles Martel became a legend overnight. The bastard son who had clawed his way to power through cunning and force was now hailed as the savior of Christendom, the hammer who had struck down the enemies of the faith. His authority, once challenged and questioned, became unassailable. No one in the Frankish lands would dare oppose him now. But the true significance of Tours would only become clear in the years and centuries that followed. The Muslim armies never again pushed so deep into Europe. They would hold Spain for centuries to come, creating a brilliant civilization of learning, art, and science that would eventually enrich all of Europe. But the dream of conquering Gaul, of carrying the crescent banner to the Atlantic and beyond, died with Abdul Rahman on that October afternoon. The high water mark of Islamic expansion into Western Europe had been reached and broken. From Charles Martel's line would come his son, Pepin the Short, who would finally claim the title of King of the Franks. And from Pepin would come Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who would unite much of Western Europe and be crowned emperor by the Pope in the year 800, creating what would become known as the Holy Roman Empire. Without the victory at Tours, none of this might have happened. The political landscape of Europe might have bent in an entirely different direction. Modern historians debate the true significance of the battle. Some argue that Abdul Rahman was merely raiding, not conquering, and that the Muslim threat to Europe was exaggerated by medieval chroniclers, desperate to create heroes. Others maintain that Tours was indeed the decisive moment when Christian Europe survived its greatest existential threat. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. But what cannot be disputed is this. On a cold hillside in central France, a Frankish army refused to break. They stood their ground when every instinct screamed at them to flee. They fought not for glory or conquest, but for survival. And because they held, because they endured, the map of Europe was drawn in one way rather than another. There are battles that crown kings. There are battles that forge empires. But once in 1,000 years, there comes a battle that decides whether an entire civilization will live or die. In the year 732, such a battle was fought. And the world we know today was born in its aftermath, shaped by the courage of men who stood together when standing seemed impossible, who faced the storm and refused to yield. The hammer had fallen, and Europe would never be the same.